as an integral of experience, intuition envelops an infinite multiplicity of details, and this happens immediately and automatically in our lived duration. This is not something that we have to produce a concept of, it's not something that we have to imagine or that we have to create out of our own effort and will. It's something that is always already happening within our consciousness for Bergson, because our consciousness is duration. Now, a sort of paradox arises because our consciousness is constantly turning reality into concepts, and it is deriving from that integral experience, concepts and words and symbols. So our consciousness is constantly pulling us away from our integral experience and delivering us over to static, finite, relative forms of knowledge. Where integral knowledge is always absolute and perfect, our knowledge that we gain through the senses, through our scientific understanding of things, through translating our experiences into language, that type of knowledge is always relative and approximate. Bergson draws out the contrast between these two types of knowledge by drawing on really beautiful, genius metaphors. On the one hand, our relative approximate knowledge is formed in a way that is analogous to the mechanism used in a cinema camera. A cinema camera, he calls this the cinematographic mechanism. So a cinema camera works with a shutter. The shutter of a camera is constantly opening and closing in order to let in light and capture it on a piece of film, and then do that again over and over again rapidly, at 10 to 30 to 60 frames per second. And basically what's happening in that operation of the camera is that it's taking in light for a very short duration, and that very short duration collects the light on this photosensitive material and basically captures that very brief duration into something static, into an image that doesn't move, doesn't change. So it collects in that light in that instance and freezes it. And what a projector then does is it rapidly shoots those pictures again in order to make movement arise back out of something static. And this is what Bergson thinks that science does, science of biology, science of evolution, when they try to understand the movement of evolution and the transformation undergoing through duration, is being sliced up and cut out and extracted, derived from the movement in order to represent that movement, and then becoming is reduced to basically this empty mechanism that just flashes images in a sequence. Our concepts are taken out of the flow of duration and used in substitution of those moments unfolding within duration. So our relative knowledge is analogous to that mechanism used within a cinema camera. On the other hand, our lived duration is analogous or metaphoric to a kaleidoscope. And I mentioned this already, but a kaleidoscope is something that changes as a whole at every moment. And this is analogous to our experience of duration. In duration, things change as a whole because past, present, and future are interwoven and interacting with each other. They're held in a kind of tension that forms an organic unity among all the moments of time. And in the same way that when an animal grows, the change doesn't happen to this part, then to this part, then to this part. It happens to the animal or whatever as a whole. The movement of a kaleidoscope shows us a kind of global change. Bergson recognized this problem in philosophy. How can we use philosophy to get at something which is ineffable, something that cannot be reduced or translated to words? Our inner life is too complex, too detail-oriented, too unique from moment to moment. Let's dig a little bit deeper into the difference between our inner life, our consciousness as felt immediately, and language. Our inner life is a continuity. It's something continuously evolving, something flowing. In that flow, there are an infinite number of possible moments that we could divide up, but we experience it as something indivisible, where each moment is flowing together, one into the next, and the past and the future are still in tension with the present. Language, on the other hand, is static and general. It speaks about things as taken out of the complexity of their relationship and used in a way that can be applied to many different situations. Each word and each symbol is necessarily to some degree finite. And our inner life is something where each moment is unique and irreplaceable with every other moment. Each moment in time is irreversible, and one goes into the next, and you cannot interchange before and after. Everything develops and grows and accumulates more and more onto the past, such that every moment of our life is new and unique and different. Language, on the other hand, is general and applicable to new situations. It's always being taken from one unique context and used in a variety of other contexts beyond that unique context. So language creates real problems for philosophy. It doesn't allow us to attain the absolute, and we are not able to just translate the absolute directly into language and symbols and to put it into speech or writing. But philosophy and metaphysics are an interpersonal project, is an attempt to understand or attain the absolute that is interpersonal and intersubjective. We need to talk about it and write things down and help each other to coordinate and sort of cross-check our understanding of the absolute, to close in more and more on what duration is, what our inner life is, what consciousness is. But the absolute can never be contained within words and simply communicated to each other. The intuition or the insight is not contained in the words and the syntax. What we put into words is only an image of the absolute, or kind of imitation of that experience that we had. So Bergson, considering all of this, figures out a method for getting us closer in a kind of intersubjective effort, a kind of science of metaphysics, that we can use language to better describe inner life and duration and consciousness. And that method is one which uses language in a very particular way. That way is metaphor. And Bergson provides many metaphors here which are meant to kind of allow us to look at time from many different angles and let the metaphors in a way fall away and let the vision of the whole, the integral view of our duration and of our inner life, of personality, of consciousness, of duration, let that emerge for each of us by simply living it. Basically, when you adopt one metaphor after another, you're able to gain access to certain aspects of lived duration, but each one of those viewpoints is necessarily limited and makes certain assumptions and leaves certain things out and is incomplete. But rather than simply trying to have an infinite number of representations of our inner life, Bergson's method uses metaphors to basically invite us to the moment where we have the intuition for ourselves. It's not a matter of accounting for every detail, but for organizing our approach to just leaping for ourselves directly back into duration. Here, Bergson is following in the footsteps of Plotinus to some degree, who says we should multiply and successively destroy different metaphors. So each metaphor kind of gives us a moment of insight, but then by moving to another one, we can destroy the previous metaphor so we don't get tied down to the images, and we move past them to the thing itself, which is our consciousness and our duration as an absolute unfolding, which we experience immediately. So Bergson puts this method directly on display in this essay, and he gives us a series of images, each one bringing to light some aspect of our inner life, but then also being mutually exclusive from the other images so that we don't stay attached to any one of them, and we move beyond this realm of metaphors and images to the thing itself, to our lived experience. So he starts by saying that our inner feeling of life is like the movement in space, right? But we shouldn't think of the space itself that we move through, but the feeling of moving, right? The feeling of traversing and of leaving behind where we just were and entering something new, right? So in time, we're constantly leaving something behind and entering into something new. And the movement of that is not the space through which we move, but the movement itself in which we feel movement happening indivisibly and continuously, right? Continuous in the sense that there is this before and there's this moving ahead into something after, but at the same time, that continuity of moment by moment is also indivisible and is all part of one fluid motion from moment to moment. Now, this image of time as movement is still slightly insufficient. In our experience of duration, the past isn't simply being completely left behind in the way when we move from one place to another, that other place is completely gone. When we move through duration, that past is kind of remains connected to the present and grows in tension as we move forward, right? As we move in duration, as we proceed forward in the continuity of time, a growing tension builds and builds and builds with our past. And the more it goes, the more tension of moments being held together in our conscious experience. Memory and perception are working together and tightening together a whole series of moments from the past into the present and contracting them and holding them in tension. In this way, our experience of time is kind of like a ball of yarn that is constantly being accumulated. It's growing, and our past at every moment is growing and accumulating more and more moments in an irreversible process. And yet, at the exact same time, we can say the opposite. Life feels like we're constantly unraveling, and we unravel more and more and more until there's nothing more, and our life is complete. And so, in some sense, duration feels like an unraveling and an unfurling of moments. Now, all of these metaphors still remain very abstract, and we can kind of think about them from the outside to some degree and kind of watch them happen in front of us. But duration isn't something that happens out in front of us, it's something that we immediately live, right? And so another metaphor comes about for Bergson, and that is moving through a color spectrum. So we have to imagine our consciousness completely absorbed in viewing a color. Completely, our entire visual field is red, and then a gradual shift towards orange, and towards yellow, and towards green, and towards blue, and towards purple, right? And in that passage, we move by imperceptible gradations, right? Infinite little nuances of change from one color to the next. And when our consciousness, if our consciousness were to move through those colors from one to the next in a complete continuity, we would have something akin to the way we experience emotions. Our emotions melt into each other, and when we're at orange, in a way that color summarizes the previous color red, but also announces the color to come, which is yellow. It has this temporal depth and thickness to it, so that at every moment there's qualitative flux, but also an interpenetrating and interconnecting from one moment to the next. So all of these metaphors get at something that is essential to duration, but at the same time, none of them can be turned into a static formula that defines duration. What they do instead is to show us multiple entry points, and if we can accomplish all at once all of those entry points simultaneously within our duration, we will gain an integral view of our duration. In a way, each of these metaphors is like a different shade within the light spectrum, and the integral view of our duration, if we could leap into it, would be like the convergent lens that puts them all back together and makes them into an integral whole. So while these metaphors are extremely evocative and very rich, they are still insufficient. What we need is to leap beyond them and for ourselves experience our own inner duration immediately for ourselves. And we can do this without mediating anything with language, without thinking about a concept, without trying really hard to make sense of it, right? No, instead, we need to just simply sympathize with the enduring quality of our consciousness, with our consciousness as it endures. We are already our duration. We are already our consciousness. We don't need to change anything. What we need to do is hesitate from just jumping to concepts. We need to wait and take out of play all of our thoughts and our cliches and our ways of making sense of our experience, and just let our experience speak for itself. Our deepest self, our integral self, is something that cannot be reduced to words and ideas. It is an infinitely complex, detailed, and nuanced mass of memories and desires and feelings and aspirations. And when we think about ourselves, it's as if we're pointing that whole self through a prism and letting little bits of it be scattered, which we take hold of here and there. So we have, the red part and the blue part and all of these parts that we can point to, but there's also infinite gradations between each one of those ideas we have of ourself. For Bergson, our self in its integral whole is the entirety of our unconscious, all of our memories, and the infinite complexity of every one of the moments of our experience. Our intellect has a very hard time seeing how that integral, expansive, holistic side of ourself is connected to ourself in the present, in which we are at every moment changing and moving and continuing our life. Bergson likens this to a cone. Again, he uses the cone metaphor. Our whole entire past is like the base of the cone, and the point of the cone is like our present moment, where we're at a kind of point and becoming in this indivisible moment. Now, how can we ever connect a point and a circle, right? A circle is something that is extended, but a point is not extended. It has no extension at all. It's a infinitely thin, small point within space. So when we try to put these two things together, we have contrary notions. We have a kind of paradox. How do we connect becoming in the present with the being of the past, this irrevocable, all of these details of our past? And when we look at a cone, we see the two fused with one another in continuity, right? The sides of the cone just perfectly go until the point, and then it's there, and you can see the concrete whole. When we disarticulate it and look at the two different concepts in isolation, we can't see how they mesh together. We can't see how our integral self can be connected with our self from moment to moment within time. But when we step back and we look at the whole, we can see immediately how they interconnect. So again, we need to jump beyond the image to the real experience that we have, because within images, multiple aspects are going to end up being contradictory to one another, and we're not going to be able to make an integral view just by simply synthesizing or combining concepts and ideas. We have to actually live the experience for ourselves. Now, before I end, I just want to say a few last things about Bergson's image of the cone, this famous and infamous image, which comes from his book Matter and Memory, but which resurfaces in the Introduction to Metaphysics and really shows an essential part in his thinking about duration. At the base of the cone is represented our integral self, our complete unconscious self with all of our memories. It's akin to the night sky with an infinite number of stars in it. Now, our consciousness is not always in touch with our entire past, or almost never is. He gives a couple instances of maybe a sort of mystical experience or a near-death experience, things like that, really get us in touch with our integral self, our concrete whole of ourself. But for the most part, we are living somewhere in the middle of the cone. And the middle of the cone represents things like general ideas, associations, and things like that. So the way we should think about this is that all of our memories are trying to get into our consciousness, but we only let in what is relevant to our life, and more or less we repress the rest of our memory, of our unconscious self. So our consciousness operates somewhere in the middle, and while it is a diminished form of ourself, it is less of ourself than our whole integral self, it is still something integral according to Bergson. So he says there are 1,000 integral unities within ourself. Now let's take a small example, like everything I know and relate to within the world of driving a car. There's all of these signs, all of these memories, everything I've learned from that. When I'm in the mindset of driving a car, certain things are relevant to me and certain things are irrelevant. Being in that degree of tension, being somewhere in the middle of the cone, I am gathering together certain of my memories, holding them in tension, but other ones are ignored in that view. So in a way you can think about this again with the kaleidoscope. When I'm at the level of consciousness of thinking of things related to my car or of things related to music or things like that, in every one of those sort of mindsets, every one of those attitudes that I adopt is itself a different degree of tension within my consciousness. Now, I can pinch myself down into the present and try to feel the indivisible progress of the present moment in its becoming and sort of push away my entire past. And at the same time, I can dilate my being out and sort of enter this dream space of the unconscious where any kind of interconnections can happen, and that's happening at the top of the cone. Now, for Bergson, when we're being creative, when we're being inventive, we are going back and forth between a type of dream state and a type of deeply deeply immersed moment within our lived duration and within the present moment of our becoming. So when we're doing metaphysics, we're oscillating back and forth, and every time we move back and forth, we enrich the view that we have of duration. We get a better sense of our past, we get a better sense of our becoming, and we get a better sense of the interconnectedness of the past and the becoming. So while this image is static, it represents a kind of movement and transformation within consciousness as we sort of dilate our being within time into the past and into the present and into the future, and through creative reintegrations of our past.